My name is Lori Black. I am the Associate Director of the Lowell Milken Fund for American Jewish Music here at the Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA. Our organization, we have the joyous job of really supporting research, performance, and education in Jewish music. And we, just as all other presenting organizations over the last 8 months, have been looking for all the creative ways that we can continue to engage with Jewish music and engage with our audiences and bring together scholars, performers, and all the wonderful mishpucha that comes together to make great music and to do great work. So with that, we're very excited that our performance, or I shouldn't say performance season, but our season of programming started a little later this year, and we're really excited that for our second program we have the opportunity to present some wonderful artists. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to one of my dear colleagues. Jeff Janesco is the Curator and Chief Operating Officer of the Milken Archive of Jewish Music and a visiting researcher with the Lowell Milken Fund for American Jewish Music. He holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from UCLA, where he's taught courses on Jewish music and ethnomusicology. His UCLA dissertation explored Jewish music and identity in the Radical Jewish Culture recording series on the Tzaddik label. And he has recently completed an essay titled Curating the Virtual Museum, Public-Facing Ethnomusicology and the Curationist Moment, which will be published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Jeff, thank you so much for hosting our first Jewish Music Masterclass of the year. Please take it away.
Wonderful. Good evening to you all, wherever you might be, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Lori, for the introduction, and thank you, Lori, Mark, and Beth, for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm honored to help you kick off the programming year, and tonight I have the distinct honor and immense challenge of introducing David Amram, and I mean honor and challenge both very seriously. I have come to know David over the past 10 years through my work with the Milken Archive. I have known a lot of musicians in my time, and there are not many that I would think to describe as humble or as gracious, but in all of my interactions with David over the years, these are the two words that most often come to my mind. I know many musicians feel that in order to be successful, one often has to project an air of confidence, perhaps arrogance, and I think David just defies this in every possible way. I have spent many hours speaking on the phone with him over the years, and I've learned one thing, and it's incredibly difficult to get him to actually talk about himself, because he spends all of his time trying to give credit to all of these other people to whom he attributes so much of his success. So his humility and his graciousness are among the reasons why I am honored to be able to host him tonight. And the challenge in hosting him lies in the fact that his humility is directly at odds with his accomplishments. David is a man who collaborated with Jack Kerouac, with Allen Ginsberg, who really helped define the beat generation that had such an influence on American culture in the latter part of the 20th century. He has provided scores for some 30 productions of Shakespeare in the Park, working with Joseph Papp. If you've been to the Public Theater in New York or Joe's Pub, that's named after Joseph Papp. David has scored films such as Splendor in the Grass and The Manchurian Candidate. He was selected by Leonard Bernstein to be the first ever composer in residence at the New York Philharmonic. He has played jazz with the likes of Charles Mingus, with Dizzy Gillespie, Lionel Hampton, and Oscar Pettiford, but has also shared the stage with people like Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, and Willie Nelson. So many people talk about crossing genres and breaking boundaries, but few people have been doing it for as long as David Amram has. His honors and awards include being inducted into the Oklahoma Jazz Hall of Fame, receiving Clearwater's Pete and Toshi Seeger Annual Power of Song Award. He has an honorary doctorate from Brooklyn College, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from Moment Magazine. These are just a few of his accolades that would take me a much longer time to list to you. He has also just had his 90th birthday, which is being celebrated with concerts and premieres of his works in New York, in Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and in other cities throughout the US and around the world. And we are very, very fortunate to be in his presence this evening. David, welcome, and I suppose happy 90th birthday. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank all of you at the Lowell Milken Foundation for American Jewish Music for being in existence, and not only being in existence, but trying to encourage a new generation to appreciate our over 5,000 years of heritage, which of course is always expressed by any culture's music. And we've got that. And in America, we have so many different forms of what's called Jewish music. And the wonderful thing about this recording series I was blessed to be part of is that it includes not all of them, that would be impossible, but a whole bunch of them, everything from symphonies and ballet and opera scores to Moshe Oisha and Kander Yusela Rosenblatt and all of the extraordinary things that are part of our amazing culture.
Wonderful, wonderful. So maybe to start off, you could just tell us a little about where and when you were born and how you first sort of got the spark to become interested in music, pursue your path.
Well, I was brought up on a farm in Feasterville, Pennsylvania. My father said to me, David, what do you want to do when you grow up? I said, well, I like to be a farmer. And he said, well, that's impossible. I have to have other work in order to afford to continue to be a farmer. And your uncle does as well. He said, what else? And I said, a jazz musician and a symphony composer. And he said, that's worse. So I had no place to go but up. And I was very fortunate hearing Kander Yusela Rosenblatt on the recordings that we had at home, hearing Ziggy Elman, a great Jewish trumpet player who was with some of the big bands, and hearing all these amazing kinds of music and realizing that so many Jewish artists were able to contribute to those musics and still maintain their own musical roots. And that was a huge thing, although I didn't really know it at the time. My uncle, who was a merchant seaman, took me to hear the Philadelphia Orchestra, and I fell in love after hearing Leopold Stokowski conduct Peter and the Wolf way back in 1936-7. And then he took me to hear Duke Ellington at the Earl Theater, and I was blown away by that. Without realizing it, my life was formed because what I'd been told, and my other uncle who came from Las Vegas, New Mexico, who was brought up with Native American people, introduced me to American Indian music because this was something that he learned along with us. So I was fortunate enough to hear all of these beautiful, sincere musics from the heart and somehow get the picture that if it touched your heart, it was worth learning about. And I've been doing it ever since.
Great, and we're so lucky that you have been doing that. So the first piece that we want to listen to and discuss tonight is a piece of yours called Shir Le'erev Shabbat. This is a Friday evening service, a complete service, I believe, that you composed for the Park Avenue Synagogue in 1961. Is that correct?
Yes, it was premiered in 1961, and I did it in 1960, and hundreds of people came. The place was packed, and Mel Brooks, just when he was getting known, came up to me with his wife-to-be Anne Bancroft, and he said, man, you had a Jewish Bach. And that was my greatest compliment up to that point in my life. I think a slight exaggeration, but the wonderful thing.
Was this your first foray into composing music with some kind of Jewish connection or some kind of sacred purpose?
Well, that was the first time that I had been asked to do it in such distinguished surroundings. We had great Maurice Perez conduct an amazing chorus, and the cantor was an extraordinary musician cantor, David J. Putterman, because he took endless hours to show me that if I transliterated the Hebrew into phonetic English, it would be possible for people not familiar with anything Jewish at all to be able to sing it correctly. And he said Handel was one of the greatest composers of all time, but he didn't really know English that well. So everyone has to sing in the Messiah, for the Lord God omnipotent. He said if he could have had omnipotent, he would have written it that way. He didn't know. He said, David, I'm sure there are gaps in your information, and I'm going to help you with every syllable. And he went over every prayer over and over. He said, you write from the heart, but be sure that it's clear to the listeners exactly what the prayers are saying. And he said, if you do that, you can't go wrong. And then, sitting behind his desk, he sang me the counting of the Omar. And when I heard him do that, I said, wow, nobody's written that down. I better start thinking. So I more or less went into my subconscious, and I know that scientists would say there is no such thing, and there's no cultural identity, and there's no DNA. I understand and respect all that stuff. However, there is something that we don't understand in all people, and heritages and things that we inherit without realizing it. And that helped me when I was sitting composing. So the very first part that we're going to hear, Ma Tovu, was the welcoming the Sabbath. And the cantor said to me, whatever you do, write something that will make people who are coming in feel that they are welcome and they're being spoken to with some reverence, rather than saying, I'm going to blow them out of the hall and get a good review in the New York Times by insulting everybody. He said, write something from the heart as if you were welcoming people into the temple, because that's what the prayer was about. And that's what I did. And years later, it was beautifully recorded for the Milken series with a wonderful, wonderful conductor who was just amazing and felt the music himself and did a great job of doing it. I'm eternally grateful to him.
And for our listeners and viewers out there, I'll just point out there's a photograph up on the screen, and in the center of that photograph is cantor David Putterman. He is standing next to Leonard Bernstein. On his right, your left, and on the other side, a composer named Max Helfman. In addition to some direction like this and helping you with the Hebrew, how much influence would you say Cantor Putterman had on the overall kind of direction and sound of this piece, or the fact that it was being premiered at this very prestigious synagogue?
Well, I think mostly he wanted to see that people would understand the Hebrew, and it was not being used as a vehicle to grind something out in order to grind something else out. And he commissioned some extraordinary pieces as a result. And I think that we'll always appreciate him for that. And more than that, he had what they called the neshama, the spirit, the soul. And he had what they called in the Mammaloshen, the krecht, the tear in the voice, which is so much a part of our music's everywhere and anywhere, as long as we can hear today what has been done for heavens knows how long and still is being done. He had that presence and that feeling that transcended his job, the huge building, all of the people's problems he had to deal with. He was able to do that, but he had something else. He was a real mensch, and he reminded me that that is the most important thing in the world.
Let's take a listen.
Alecho
absolutely amazing to hear the way the soloist and the chorus really they play off each other, and how the organ you almost don't notice until you make us notice it.
Well, the wonderful thing was too that it was done in I believe in London, and I think most of the singers I asked, their great conductor, weren't Jewish and weren't even familiar with that idiom, and somehow they got it, because the music, if you have it in you and you can somehow put it down on the paper, and you're lucky enough to have a really fine conductor and wonderful musicians, you can somehow create something that will make people who are playing it that don't know you, who don't want to hear your big spiel, feel something. That's the basic idea of what it's all about. And then the listener feels something. And that's unfortunately, so far, the last thing that we're taught in school about composing music, writing a book, painting a picture, or even having a conversation with another person.
And of course, this is something that holds true not just for Jewish music, but any music. You don't necessarily have to have a background or an experience in it, but you have to have somebody leading you through it, no?
Exactly. And the subways in New York City, they had a wonderful old slogan: you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy Levy's rye bread. So I think that applies to anything and everything. You find out the more that you work in music, that as an expression of the soul and an unspoken history in sound, everyone has a culture, everyone has a heritage, and they're all precious, they're all sacred, and they're all worthy. So when you're told, tone down your ethnicity, that's understandable, but it's not required. And in fact, all of what we call ethnicity, a code word for subhuman, only means that the people who feel that way don't celebrate their own heritage or aren't even aware that they have one.
And you mentioned the word soul, which I gather is important to you for a number of reasons, mainly because it's used in the title of the next piece we're going to look at. This is Symphony Songs of the Soul, or Shirei Neshama in the Hebrew subtitle that you gave it. This was commissioned, I believe, in 1986 for a Jewish arts festival that was occurring on Long Island. When you wrote this, you said that you wanted to celebrate the polycultural nature of the Jewish people. Is that accurate?
Oh, sure. And also the last movement was based on the wonderful Yemenite setting of the prayer, Lecha Dodi. It used those wonderful rhythms. The fantastic tambourine techniques that they use in that music. And of course, the glorious folk melody. Etc. And I learned and played that for several years with Avram Pengas, great Israeli who came from the Greek Jewish community, moved to Israel. Then he moved, fortunately for us, to the United States and brought some of that wonderful music. And I spent years playing that with him and George Mogradician, a great oud player, until I could get it right with the ornamentation, with everything else, the feeling. And then was able to notate it so that symphony players picking their instruments up out of the case and sitting down at a chair could take that piece of paper and turn it into a piece of music. I was very fortunate. And when Chris Wilkins conducted it with the Berlin Orchestra, I wasn't around to give a big talk, but the music did the talking. Mm-hmm. And Chris did a wonderful job. And the orchestra, I'm sure, hadn't played ba, ba. Everyone who's been to a bar mitzvah or a wedding has heard the people do that. And when you get up in that chair, suddenly you're transported back to another time and place. And we tried to do some of that in the piece, and it went over really well. I even got, when I went to David Barossa to Israel to perform it with the Ranana Symphoniette, and people there loved it, even though they hear that melody and know it every single day of their life. So the music really kind of tells you what to do. And I've never planned anything except each day to try to do the best that I can. And I'm still trying to do that. So I was just lucky to be asked to do it and have a chance to do this as a thank you note to all those who came before me and all those here today and everyone in the future that will keep our culture and the sense of identity alive.
Now, of course, the music can communicate quite a lot, but there are limitations to what we can communicate in notation, aren't there? Is that an issue that how do you bridge that gap between what's on the page and what you really want it to sound like, especially when you're not present?
Well, you have to be meticulous, you have to be careful, and you have to have enough of an attitude. So when the musicians say, I wonder what it meant by that, if you're around, you can help by singing it. And then they say, that's not the way you've written it down. I say, whoa. So you change. And the best way to see that is to Gustav Mahler's beautiful Adagietto in his symphony, I believe the Fifth Symphony, and every single note in that string is only for strings in the middle of a symphony. Everything has something marked on it. So when my music copyist said, David, you're a control freak, I said, no, I want to get it right so the musicians will feel something from what they're seeing on the paper. And you can't really be clear enough, but if you make the effort and you really go over it enough times, you can end up notating just about anything and having it be playable. And say something, because if it doesn't say something, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are. The music has to do the talking.
Sure. Now, speaking of the idea of the polycultural nature of the Jewish people, you used many different folk traditions and many different sources in this symphony, right? I think the first movement, there's some Ethiopian kind of incantation in it. The second movement, I believe, is original, but you kind of modeled it off of a Hasidic nigun. And then in the third movement, there's the Passover, the Yemenite Passover melody the Yemenite Lecharodi that you just played. But there is also a Sephardic folk tune at one point in there, correct? So how does a composer, or what kind of challenges might you have faced with respect to using so many different sources in a single piece?
Fortunately, no one asked me to do any of that. So they didn't give me a list and say, after you thank the sponsors, you have to put in this and do that. I appreciate and understand that. But mostly, when you look at the great architectural achievements, the people who said we want to build something and they give you an idea and then they leave the people alone to do the best that they can. So I try to do that when I'm conducting or playing with other people. And at the same time, when I'm not told, we want something sad, we want to hear this, we want to hear that, I can actually think of something myself. That's kind of my job. So I decided I would try to use some of these beautiful things that I had played and beautiful experiences that I'd heard of other people playing and get that spirit. And then you wouldn't really be able to know what was folkloric. And every time I put down even one measure of a melody, I mentioned, or a rhythm, I put down in the score what it was, where I learned it, and who taught it to me. And I say that because if you're given a gift, or if you have a mitzvah, you could at least say thank you. If you can't say toda rabah, you can certainly say thank you to a gift. Then you're honoring a gift rather than stealing. There's a big difference. The copyright laws don't reflect that, but the laws of decent behavior reflect that. And after a certain point, if you're playing with Native American people, which I've done all my life, or anybody, and they're used to seeing people coming in and ripping off what little bit they have left, especially when you get over 40 or 50 and you're not no longer responsible for hiding who you are because your face shows it. When they see someone who's a cultural rip-off artist, they hide the silverware and everything else because they know it's only going to be stolen and putrefied and then use their good name to justify it. So the way to get not to be involved in that is just to learn to say please and thank you to everybody. And especially if you're composing and someone shows you something, to thank them by acknowledging that gift. And also, if you're writing a score, to put in who it was that showed it to you. That's why I love Charles Ives, put all kinds of notes in his wonderful symphonies that he learned that on a rock when his grandfather had a band in Danbury, Connecticut, and he goes on and on. But it's kind of wonderful. He was saying thank you and showing that his life was formed by what he wrote, and what he wrote was formed by his life.
Wonderful. So as we turn to listening to this symphony, we're going to listen to the third movement. It's subtitled Dance of Joy. I believe this follows a basic kind of rondo in terms of form.
Yes.
I have provided a very rough structural outline for this movement. If you want to take issue with it at any point, feel free. I have just listened through. I thought it might help our listeners to try to follow along some of the different sections here. And I've just pointed out the couple of moments where there is a folk melody, at least one that I was able to identify in there. So this movement lasts about 15 minutes. So maybe, David, before we listen to it, maybe you want to just play that Lechato D for us one more time so we get the theme kind of in our heads.
I'll just play a fraction of it because the orchestra plays it better. Etc., etc. I don't want to spoil it, but anyway, I'm just so happy that you can play it and that all of you who are coming can hear it. And I hope this inspires you to write something of your own yourself. And if you're discouraged and you're told it's too ethnic, that's a compliment. If they say it's not ethnic enough, that also is their First Amendment right to discourage you. But creativity, music has nothing to do with any of that.
There we go. Wow.
Terrific.
When's the last time you just sat and listened to a piece of music for 15 minutes?
I haven't heard that in years, and it was just terrific. And if I may, I want to thank Herb Alpert, who created the course that all of you are coming. I remember he was a wonderful trumpet player with a Latin band, and he started off his record company in his garage and made that enormous, great series of recordings. And he did what the Talmud would tell us to do, what Dizzy Gillespie told me on his 70th birthday, not familiar with the Talmud, the same message. It's time to put something back into the pot. And our whole idea of tzedakah is not to throw some money at an underprivileged person, but to share in some way our blessings with others. And Herb has done that. And it's wonderful to know that in the heart of Los Angeles in 2020, a whole bunch of you are going to a school that he created to help to study and appreciate and respect this music. And also, I forgot to mention the great conductor who conducted the very beginning piece was Kenneth Kiesler. And he recently did a premiere of a symphony of mine called Partners for Violin, Cello, and Orchestra that didn't really have any Jewish materials. And with all the different things that I tried to honor there, the first movement was for Woody Guthrie, the second for, I'll think of it in a minute, and the third celebrating Afro-Cuban and jazz music, Machito and Celia Cruz. The first was Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. The second was Billie Holiday and Lester Young. Kenneth understood those idioms because, like myself, he's Jewish, but also American, and understands the plurality that we have is something beautiful to be studied. And he's a great master conductor of the European standard repertoire as well. And a bunch of other people, especially those in your generation of students, are now finding out that you can speak more than one language, and you can go to more than one fast food restaurant in your life and possibly even be better nourished by checking out some of that home cooking and what your grandmother and great-grandmother did and what other people's great-grandmothers and mothers did, and understand all the bills of fare are different and nutritious, and all the cultures, all the religions, all of the musics are beautiful. A lifetime study. So there's nothing to cross over to, because in the land of beauty, if you take a bridge and go from one place to another, you're still in that land of beauty. You're just going to a different place. And chopsticks, blink, 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 blunk, 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 and contrary motion is already fusion. All music is fusion. So the words fusion and crossover were used. Now after thinking I was a nutcase all my life, now I'm complimented as being a pioneer of world music. Well, Homer didn't do a bad job either when he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and neither did Aeschylus and the playwrights who wrote about things that happened, or all of Shakespeare's plays, which take place in different cultures. Most artists or people who we enjoy being with and whose work endures are familiar that there's something besides staring in the mirror, and that there are other things, other people, other places that are beautiful and worthy. And it's so wonderful to see that in spite of all the horrors that we've been going through for over 5,000 years, today's generation realizes that you can, as the Native American folks say, have your feet in both canoes. You can be part of the pure culture and still retain the beauty of the gift, the mitzvah that was given to us at birth. Just wanted to say that because
thank you for sharing that. Speaking of having multiple feet in multiple canoes, and mentioning the name Kenneth Kiesler, he also conducted the final piece we're going to hear tonight, which is a piece called "The Final Ingredient." This is an opera that was set in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And this involves a group of prisoners who want to hold a Passover Seder, but they can't get any of the items that they need to do that. So they go to kind of great lengths to gather these different ingredients. And there are kind of many different layers of meaning within this opera. But maybe you could just tell us a little about how you became involved in it.
Well, this was something I was asked to write, a wonderful story by a playwright, Mr. Rose, who had written it for television based on a true story of people who were incarcerated and waiting to die, as many of my relatives, unfortunate enough to stay there, also did. And still, they wanted to celebrate Passover. They found some way to create a Passover service under the eyes of the guards. And I ended up with a triumphant song of Yigdal, Yigdal Elohim Chai, because I didn't want it to be totally depressing. It was depressing enough at the end to make people just feel terrible. And this was done in 1965 on ABC network television. There was no Schindler's List that we knew of at that. There was, of course, that famous list, but no one knew that the play, the book, the film hadn't come out. And amazingly enough, they showed it every Passover for 4 years. And
Wow.
then ABC television decided they didn't want anything that was in black and white because people were buying color TVs. So they dumped 30,000 tapes of operas, ballets, and heavens knows what. And fortunately, the person who produced it had one copy in his back room. So I was able to preserve the video and the music and the tape of it. And it was just a thrill to work to do this and to pay homage to the people that I knew who had perished and the people who didn't. And the fact that we are still here.
Now, I am not an expert on liturgy or Jewish ritual per se, but the Yigdal is not normally included in a Passover service. Is that correct?
I took the liberty of sneaking that in because I thought it would help the end of an opera as a piece that was supposed to paint a picture, to have them singing that. Obviously, they wouldn't have been doing that in a concentration camp, I imagine. Mm-hmm. And they certainly wouldn't have had a symphony orchestra playing along with it. And it was just a thrill. I was able to conduct it myself with some wonderful musicians. Even Ezio Flagello sang a solo part of the Met Opera. A lot of friends of mine were in it, done in 1965. And like many things, a lot of these pieces and other ones I've written, not only recently, but a long time ago, are being done. So for all of you students at the Herb Alpert School, if you're writing something or writing a book or doing anything, and you get a bunch of rejection slips, don't take it personally. Just remember, Moses was in the desert 40 years. So you're right on schedule.
We're going to listen to just about a 4 or 5 minute excerpt from scene 10 that involves this singing of Yigdal. And then we will take some questions. I think that's a very triumphant way to end our program tonight. I want to thank David for joining us. Before we turn to questions, just remind everyone, if you want to learn more about David's work in the Milken Archive, you can visit www.milkenarchive.org. If you want to learn more about David Amram's very vast and impressive body of work beyond the few pieces that are included in the Milken Archive, you can learn more about him at davidamram.com. If you want to try to keep up with him at all, I would only say good luck. He's as busy as ever, and I'm constantly seeing your name in the news. It seems like there's just constantly things going on. And with that, I will thank everyone once again. Thank David. And I believe, Lori, do we have questions in a chat room here?
I've opened the chat. Please feel free to post your questions. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask your question the old-fashioned way.
And I'll try to give a short answer.
No questions.
Well, if we don't have any yet, I've asked a lot of questions so far. Maybe I'll take
Fair enough.
asking one more concerning this last piece. The topic, the Holocaust, this is often something that people have very strong feelings about, whether it should be dealt with musically, how it should be dealt with musically. Is this, were there any kind of ethical questions that came up for you in working on this piece?
Yoel, I was a very good friend with Igor Sudarsky, who had the Art Foods Delicatessen. He and his wife had both been survivors of the Holocaust, were separated, didn't realize that each other were alive, found themselves together after the war was over. They sat up on a hill, he said, and they were eating some humantasche. And Igor said, I turned to my wife and I said to her, if I had to go through all of this, I had better learn what being Jewish is, and will always be about. So he, like many of us, became a late-in-life yeshiva bocher, so to speak, a student. And his delicatessen was sort of a great learning ground for all of us who were privileged enough to live in the United States and be whoever, whatever, however we wanted to be every minute, and very often not pay attention to what we were a part of by a gift, not a necessity or a star that you have to wear in a camp, but by the gift of our heritage and culture. And I said, Igor, in the opera, he liked the libretto that Arnold Weinstein had written. But I said, I want to make sure that the part of the guards was not a stereotypical, like the wonderful comedy series that they had on television showing people in a prison camp, Americans, where the guards were all buffoons. I wanted to make it really what it was like. And he helped me with every single thing to say this is exactly the way they spoke, and the ones that had a Schwäbisch accent and the ones who had a Bayerische accent, that kind of thing. So I was able to get that really being authentic, and from understanding not only with the great Rudolf Serkin and the masters of European classical music that I was lucky enough to work with, but also from Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Lester Young, who said in their own way, whatever you were doing, don't copy us, be you, tell your story. So when I was conducting the singers, many of whom were Jewish, and the ones who were kind of had to hide that so they would get some gigs for those who did not care for Jewish people. I said, you have to do what you feel. Just let the music and the story tell you what to do. And I was amazed in hearing what Lowell was able to get everyone to do, and also in the beautiful concerts that were done in Berlin, the fact that the music and what we'd written did help everyone to sing in a certain way. And then the opera really came off the way. Ezio Flagello was Italian-American, a great violinist that could sight read and sing like an incredible singer with the Met. And he was able to sing one of the lead parts and just break your heart. It was so beautiful. And he said, well, Italian opera, said Puccini, we've got that too. It's just a different way of the same spirit, the same soulfulness. So I think it really comes to that. And if you're using words, you have to have, certainly for something like the Holocaust, a good story and something that's respectful and accurate and human. And I think that it came off that way, and I'm very proud and grateful I had a chance to do it. I also wrote a cantata with Langston Hughes based on the Yiskar, which they did at the San Francisco Opera House. And that was wonderful too. And when we mentioned, we saw the person who was the head of the United Hebrew Congregations, and he went into this long rap about, well, Mr. Hughes, there's a certain feeling of the Jewish people which is difficult to assimilate and understand. He kept going on and on and on. Langston said, I think I understand what you're saying, Rabbi, because my grandfather was Jewish. And that ended the conversation. But I think that what we can use is whatever we're born into, whatever gift or gifts we have in a polycultural society, we can learn to celebrate those. And then if you appreciate your own gifts, you can be with people from a different culture and appreciate their gifts, and they'll see that you're not there pretending to be them because you despise yourself, and then trying to take what they have and steal it, but rather to appreciate as a fellow human being the spirituality and the history and the uniqueness of every person who crosses your path. And that's the good thing that music teaches you, that we can get above all the limitations of narrow thinking, most of which is self-destructive because it stops you from being you. So I hope that all the students at the school, if they're asked, what is Jewish music? Say, well, I don't know if any of us know, but it definitely is something. So it's worth studying, and we'll never find out. But that in itself is very encouraging. And that doesn't mean that you're being humble. It just means what I said in the beginning of the program about being a mensch. When I was on tour with David Bross, I said, my grandfather always said, whether you came over in steerage or you were the head of some gigantic, successful business, the most important thing in the world was to be a mensch. How would you say that in Yiddish? He said, well, the Mama Lushan is a colonial language, so that and Ladino, which most of my Sephardic relatives don't speak anymore either, those were considered to be colonial languages. So they had a typical Israeli argument with 6 people in a microbus eating hummus, falafel, batahidi, and yelling at each other. And after 14 different opinions from 5 people, they ended up saying, Hadavar hachi yashuv b'chaim zelechiyot ben adam. That means the most important thing. Ben adam meant real mensch. Now David told me that 20 years later, they're teaching Yiddish and Ladino in schools in Israel as part of our historic culture. So I mention all that because the foundation not only was graced me by doing a whole CD of my orchestral and operatic and choral music, but also did operas like The Golem that was fantastic, which was dismissed by the New York Times before it even got a chance to be heard, I think, because they didn't want anything too Jewish. And conversely, so many of the people like Mickey Katz, a great entertainer, had an incredible orchestra. Moshe Oisha and those great old-time singers were amazing. Molly Pecan and the Yiddish Theater were fantastic. So were the Ladino folkloric musicians. And so much of the music, Nico Castell sang in the Metropolitan Opera and also was a Sephardic cantor. There's an enormous amount of music that we have which has not been acknowledged, generally speaking. And I think that your foundation, the wonderful foundation, helps to make people aware that there's a whole, as Elvis Presley said in Carl Perkins' song, there's a whole lot of shaking going on. And we can participate and celebrate in all of that. And the plurality doesn't mean it's dispersed or it's not an identity. It means that there are many identities and many flavors and many colors in Jacob's coat of many colors.
So on that note, there's a question from one of our viewers. Mark Hoffman wants to know what you think is the most important Jewish influence on American music. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I would think probably what was written for the theater. Those incredibly gifted, amazing songwriters who wrote what we call standards, which are the backbone of jazz and are heard all over the world, also became the backbone of the theater when the theater disintegrated into having helicopters landing on stage and trying to compete with professional wrestling as a way of being entertaining. They had revivals of some of these amazing composers' works that were musical comedies, but were really great music. And I think that they're an enormous influence. Certainly George Gershwin has been a colossal influence on all the forms of music. And when you listen to some of the beautiful things in Porgy and Bess, you can also hear some of the Hasidic music that he heard as a young boy when he was living in Brooklyn, and everything else that comes with it. And I think that these were giants, what they call the American Songbook. They're predominantly Jewish songwriters, and because they were brought up learning to sing and dance at home. And so are a lot of other cultures, and a lot of cultures are arriving in America, and we have to respect them because they're in the same position that our parents and grandparents were, and they have something to say and enrich all of our lives, just as the Jewish composers back then did, who've enriched our lives.
I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody who has a hand up or anything here. I think there's only one other question in the chat, and then I have one more. Someone wants to know your connection to the children's musician Rafi, who mentions you in a song. He rhymes your name with the word jam, I believe.
Yes, that was Rafi. And Rafi, when I was playing with Ramble and Jack Elliott, also named Elliott Adnapose, but he changed his name to Jack Elliott. And I was in Toronto in 1970 doing a program for CBC, and of all different kinds of music, and how Bartok influenced Charlie Parker, and how Charlie Parker loved Ravel, and how Ravel influenced, that kind of thing. We do everything from Eskimo chants to symphony music and show a relationship, not that they were the same, but they were all part of the same world of beauty and related in some way. Anyway, I was done the program. Jack said, I hear you're up here. He said, come on and play with me. You could stay on a cot in my room, we'll hang out. And I wasn't married, I had no responsibilities. And he was so much fun to be with. So every night I played with him in a little place in Yorkville, which in 1970 was like Greenwich Village was. And like the place in the west,
I wonder if we lost David. I know once in a while Zoom will, if it disconnects, it will reconnect. I suppose we could wait a moment.
It's a wonderful program. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here.
Thank you. It was extraordinary.
He's a wonderful person to talk to.
Sure.
Jeff, since you've interviewed him and have talked to David Amram,
yeah, he's calling me now.
He's calling you back. Okay, great.
Hi, David.
Why don't we take this quick moment to just do a quick shameless plug for the Lowell Milken Fund and the projects that we have coming up. We have a lot of wonderful stuff happening this year. We will be offering some live streamed chamber music programs, book talks. We have a true range of programming, and if you want to, keep up with it and see as much as you can, please follow us both on Facebook and by joining our mailing list. It was just dropped into the chat now, where it says tinyurl.com/UCLA Jewish Music. Follow that, and you'll be able to keep up with everything. We have a very exciting year, and we hope to see all of you again soon. So hopefully with that.
No voice.
And I also wanted to take this quick moment to acknowledge our no voice here.
You got your voice
I
back.
believe David is going to be back to join us shortly here. He just lost power to his computer, and he says he's connecting now. And he really wants to answer the question about.
Here he is. He's coming back.
Excellent.
UCLA.
Yes.
Oh, I apologize.
He's a professor.
Hi. Now to answer, I was trying to tell. Was that you, ma'am, that was asking the question
Where are you, David?
about the song, the peanut butter sandwich song? Someone was asking a question.
Yes, I asked that question about
Oh, okay. Well, anyway.
me and Amram, what he
yes.
talks about. You and the peanut butter sandwich.
Oh, okay. Well, what happened was I was playing with Jack Elliott, and a young Canadian singer named Rafi Kavukian came down every night because he was a Jack Elliott fanatic. And we used to go to his house every night after we were done playing and stay up all night playing music until his wife, who had a good job and was kind of helping him out to be a folk singer on the weekend, said, "Fellas, I think it's time for you to go home. I have to go to work." And then we would go home and sleep all day and play all night. So at any rate, years later, my kids, I got married, and my two oldest daughters, my little son was just starting, and they said, "Daddy, this guy's singing about you on the record." I said, "What? What guy? What record?" And they said, "That's that song, Peanut Butter." So I listened to the song. I said, "My heavens, peanut butter sandwich jelly with jam, one for me and one for David Amram." And they said, "Well," and I think it's on TV. So I turned on, and sure enough, it was on that kids channel that they had all the time. So I said, "I better call up Rafi." I said, "Rafi, it's Dave Amram." He said, "What are you doing, man? I haven't seen you in years." I said, "I can never thank you enough. Everything I've done in my life, the only thing that ever impressed my children was being on your song. How can I possibly thank you?" And he said, "Well, I had to finish it, and I couldn't think of anything to rhyme with jam." So sometimes you get lucky.
Oh, well, David, as we're thinking about kind of coming to a close here, this is a masterclass. You are a composer. I wonder if I could ask, what advice might you have for young composers kind of going into the field about how to build a career in music?
Well, I've always told people I never thought about having a career. I hope someday my music will have a career. And that's the way to look at it. Then every single thing that you do in life, every single person, every joke you hear, every bird sound you hear, every time you hear the wind going through the trees, every time you hear somebody whistling a song, anything that you hear and feel touches your heart, that's worth thinking about. And also if you can improvise, all the pieces that we heard, every note was written out meticulously. But if you can improvise, your DNA tells you what feels natural, what feels right, or if you have 37 choices of what you can make for the next note or the next chord or whatever, your feelings ultimately tell you what to do, not your automechanical training or who you know or what was written about you. The music has to be right, and the musicians can feel that if it's correct enough and make something out of it and then make their own story. So that's a long-winded way of saying try to be yourself. And if you're not satisfied with yourself, it's possible to improve yourself, but don't necessarily try to imitate what you're told you could have been or should have been or might be, and do something that's against your grain, and try to listen to everybody and have respect for them, and to hang out with musicians and singers and players and conductors, because they're the ones who are creating the music, and not to fall into the trap that many people in my generation were forced to think that other composers from Bach and way back from Guillaume de Machaut all the way up to Bach and ever since Bach are your enemy, that the conductors are your enemy and the musicians in the orchestra are your enemy and the world is your enemy. That's okay. It's hard enough anyway. So the main thing is not to think about that, but to try to find the beauty of being with other people and learning from them, because everybody can teach you a lesson if you learn to say please and thank you. Actually, I have 7 honorary doctorates, but I always tell people in the vernacular, the one I've had the longest is a doctor at the University of Hangoutology, even though I'm still a freshman, and I plan on being there until my 110th birthday. And then if I can't succeed in what I hoped I might possibly get started being, I'll switch over and become a nasty, abusive creep. But until that time, I'm going to still try to be a good yeshiva bucher, that means a student, and learn from other people who know more and are better than I am. And I could give you a whole Baedeker's list of that. And once you see that, then instead of being depressed, you don't need a psychiatrist, a dope dealer, a guru, or to change your identity or your name in order to satisfy somebody, but just to try to be yourself and what you are here to offer, and figure we're all put here to do something. Everybody's got a story and they're all valuable. So when you're told, if you're told, to give up, that you're no good, that you're wasting your time, that no one wants to hear music, that's people's constitutional right to give you that kind of career counseling, but hang out with somebody else.
Well, I see my colleague Bonnie in the chat says you are an incomparable life force. I could not agree with her more. I learn something new every time I talk to you. I want to thank you for being with us tonight, for sharing your time and your wisdom. I know you like to say that no matter what age you are, you're just getting started and just trying to get it right, but you have a lot to offer and a lot to teach. So thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. Thank you to Mark, to Lori, to Beth at the Lowell Milken Fund for American Jewish Music at UCLA for inviting me to be a part of this. I'd say we started the programming year pretty strong tonight.
Well, I thank you all, and just remember, those of you who are over 21 and you're told you're too old, that's people's prerogative. But I can only say, since Live Fast and Die Young was a way of keeping everyone's salary and self-esteem down, that premature expiration is highly overrated. Number 2, you're only as old as you make other people feel. So just celebrate every minute of life as long as you can keep the old carcass moving. And if you're considered to be an outsider or eccentric because you're following what you love to do, just remember the advice I was given recently, which Jerry Farris, a great silversmith and jewel maker, said, you know, when I went back to playing the guitar, I said to my good old friend, I think I'm on the edge. He said, that's the only place to be in life. He said, you got to spend your whole life on the edge. He said, otherwise, you're taking up too much space.
That's a good one.
Wonderful. Mark, Lori, Beth, would any of you care to offer any closing words before we all get on with our lives?
Thank you all for joining us. We're really appreciative of David Amram being able to join us and to kick off our masterclass series. We have many wonderful events ahead. We have various workshop programs, more masterclasses, book talks, and various concerts that are coming up, all online and free. We're very grateful for our support from the Lowell Milken Family Foundation and my real partner in all things that we do, to Dr. Jeff Janesco. Thank you for so much for getting us off to a great start, and we hope you can join us again soon.